Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? We ride the stories of the West. Campfire truths, trail dust, memories, saloon whispers. Gritty humans, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The wind did not howl so much as grind its teeth. It came down from the Sangre de Cristo like a living thing shoving drifts against the cabin and rattling the tiny wind chime Mason Hale had hung beneath the eave. The chime clicked and went quiet, clicked and went quiet, a thin sound swallowed by white. Inside, lamplight trembled over a plank table and an oiled rag. Mason sat square at the edge of the glow, a Winchester open in his hands, his thumb pushing a black ribbon of soot from the bore. He worked without hurry. The stove popped. Sap hissed in the seams of the split pinon. Every few breaths, the cabin let out a long, tired groan, as if it remembered a warmer state and missed it. The dog mound by the cottonwoods was a low, white hump, now snow over snow. Rust had gone last winter when the cold came too early. Mason had not filled the hole all the way. The ground had done it for him. Rosie, the old mule, shifted in the lean-to and thunked a hoof, a small comfort in a world that had been reduced to windwood and iron. Mason brushed the last bit of powder grit from the rifle's throat and closed the action. He set the Winchester in the corner by the door sight forward. He wiped the table with the edge of his sleeve and reached for the coffee pot. The dregs tasted like burned bark. He drank anyway. The chime hit a new note, not the chime at all. A dull, wrong thump stumbled against the door. He did not move at first. The wind can throw a branch just so. Then came a scrape low and dragging as if something with hands had lost its feet. Mason stood. The chair legs rasped. He felt the room contract around the sound, felt the heat from the stove lean toward the cold, like a dog at a crack in the door. He crossed the room palm flat to the wood. The grain was cold through the glove, the cold of river stones. He tapped the jamb 3 times with his knuckles. A habit. 3 meant his, 2 meant not. The next thump landed as if it had been waiting for the signal. He slid the bolt and shouldered the door open into a wall of white. Snow blew in hard enough to kill the lamp nearest the sill. His breath lathered the dark. The world beyond the stoop was a single heaving surface. A form lay at the base of the drift, a collapsed shadow pressed to the boards. He stepped out. The cold bit through denim and wool, in one breath, teeth to bone. He crouched and gripped fabric that felt like wet paper. The body turned. A face rolled up to him, the color of skimmed milk hair rimmed with ice and clotted rust. A girl young, lips split, lashes webbed with frost. The wind took a handful of snow and threw it at them both. Mason slid an arm under her knees and another behind her back. She weighed next to nothing. The dead do not weigh this little, he thought, without meaning to. He pivoted on the porch half blind and shouldered the door shut with his hip. The latch tongue bit wood. Snow sheeted to the floor in a sludge. He set her on the rag rug by the stove. Heat took her in small bites, steam lifting off the torn dress like breath off a horse. He stripped his gloves and set them on the hearthstone. Her feet were barren purple toes swollen to swollen grapes. Her hands were cracked where they had bled and bled again. The dress was a cheap calico, the print washed to ghosts. It had ripped along the side. Beneath the rip at the edge of her hip, something dark had frozen into the cloth. He leaned in. Blood had crusted high on her left side in a long, ugly smear. Not a hole through. A tear. It had taken cloth and dirt with it. He could smell iron through the stink of wet wool. Her chest shivered in shallow jerks. A breath, a catch. He watched her throat for the next one, and got it thin and stubborn. Good. Mason stood moved to the dry sink and upended the bucket into the kettle. He swung the kettle over the hot plate. The handle squealed. He opened the cupboard and pulled down a chipped bowl. A spoon, a tin of salt. He set the bowl aside and reached into the drawer where he kept the knives found, the one he used on knots and rabbits alike, and the little roll of cloth that had once held his wife's needles. The cloth was clean. The space where the fine bone needle had been was empty. He glanced at the trunk under the window. A scuff of polish still clung to the lid. Abigail's initials were cut into the top, with a nail careful, almost shy. He let the glance die and turned back to the stove. The girl made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a calf makes when the rope slides and the knot bites in a tender place. He squatted, palms open and empty. "Can you hear me?" he said. His voice sounded like a shovel in gravel. "You're inside. You're by a fire." Her eyes cracked open to a thin blue slice. She saw a man and a knife in the hot belly of the stove. She flinched as if the air had struck her. He set the knife on the floor blade away. He held up both hands again. I'm going to warm water. That is all I'm doing." Her lips shaped a sound that did not make it out. He lifted the kettle and poured a little into a tin cup, the steam fat and sweet with the smell of iron rust in the well water. He set the cup near her mouth and tipped it a hair. "Slow," he said. "Wet your tongue first." She took a sip and swallowed like it hurt. He could see the swallow ripple down her throat. She closed her eyes as if that little heat might save her by itself. The wind shoved at the walls. The chime clicked once and fell silent again. Rosie thunked a hoof and blew in the lean-to. The cabin had become a skin around 4 living things and the storm outside. He slid a folded wool blanket from his cot and draped it over the girl, careful of the stiff edge where blood had frozen into cloth. The blanket smelled of smoke and old soap. He tucked it to her chin. Her face was a plain thing pulled tight over sharp bones, the kind of face hunger makes. Her hair might have been brown once. Snow had washed it to a hard, wet color with red in it. He stood and listened to her breath count, 1, 2, 3. The kettle began the low singing it made just before it boiled. He set the tin cup back on the stove shelf and went to the door. He put his ear to the seam. Only wind. He tapped the jamb 3 times and waited for nothing to answer. At the table he tore a strip from a clean flour sack and rolled it tight. He took down the little tin of pine pitch salve he used for shearing nicks and splinters. He set them in a row cloth strip salve knife he would not pick up until he had to. The kettle lifted its voice. He took it off, poured into the bowl, and watched steam unspool. He went back to the rug and knelt. "I am going to lift the edge of the dress," he said. "I need to see the cut. That is all." Her eyes opened. They were clearer now, blue without much in them. She did not speak. She made her jaw square as if bracing for ice water. Mason put his fingertips to the torn hem. The fabric crackled where blood had glued it to skin. He breathed once through his nose slow and waited for the next breath to come. Then he began. The cloth lifted with a sound like ice breaking on a creek. Dried blood had glued the calico edge to skin. Mason worked the hem free a finger width at a time, dipping a rag in hot water and letting the steam loosen what the cold had welded. Heat brought the copper smell up sharp. He did not look at anything. He did not have to. He kept his eyes on the line he meant to clean. The tear ran along the outside of her left hip, a long, shallow furrow where a bullet had taken a kiss and kept going. The skin around it was swollen and hot, peppered with grit and thread lint, a bit of dress trapped in flesh. The wound had frozen on the outside and festered beneath. He could see it without needing the word. Her breath hitched when the soaked rag touched her. She jolted like a trout under a hand. Her eyes came open all at once, blue blown wide. She did not see a cabin. She saw a man and a knife in the wall at her back. Her hands flew to cover herself. One palm caught his wrist. It was small and bird-boned and fierce with fear. "Hold," he said low. He set the knife flat on the planks where she could see it. "I am cleaning the cut. That is all." Her jaw worked. She tried to sit, failed, propped herself on one elbow, then relented and went still by effort alone. Her gaze slid away from his face to the stovetop where the kettle breathed. He went back to the rag. Hot water darkened the crust and lifted it in slivers. He wiped and rinsed and wiped again. Each touch made her flank go tight as wire. "Drink," he said, and held the tin cup. She took it in both hands. The cup knocked her teeth once before she steadied. She took 2 swallows. Some of it ran from the corner of her mouth. He caught that with the edge of a clean cloth, without touching skin. He had to see how far the tear ran. He set the rag and reached for the knife, showed it to her, turned the blade so the lamplight slid along it, then set the point to the frozen cloth above the wound and cut. The sound of the slice was crisp and wrong against the room's small sounds. A strip peeled away. The dress fell in 2 sad pieces, barely a garment at all. He kept his shoulders square between her and the door and used his body to give her what privacy a one-room cabin could offer. Under the torn dress, the ribs showed like worn staves. Old bruises had gone to yellow at the edges. New ones were purple and mean. At her collarbone, just below the point where the neck dipped, hollow ink and scar had darkened the skin to a brand. A J winged inside a 5-point star, a J burned over the bird's heart. He knew it by sight. He had seen it once on a girl lifted from the river ice below Pueblo when the thaw came. He had not stayed for the talk. He had gone home and put his fist through a shed door and then repaired the door because a hole would not keep weather out. His face did not change. He took another cloth, dipped it, and pressed it to the wound. Pine pitch salve would need a clean bed to cling to. The heat dragged a hiss from her and a noise between her teeth that was half curse, half prayer. "If I do not clean it, you will lose the leg," he said. "If I do clean it, it will hurt." "Do it," she whispered. He did. He took away the dirt and thread and a tiny splinter of wood that must have ridden there from some plank or fence. He held the splinter up to the light so the mind would believe the trouble was smaller now than it had been. He did not say that aloud. He rinsed the bowl and fetched fresh water, then worked until the crimson smear on the rag ran paler and then pink. Her breathing settled into a rhythm that matched his motions. He felt it happen, the room joining the work. The stove, the kettle, the wind. Outside, the chime ticked and fell still. The mule blew again and scraped to the floor with her shoe. He opened the small tin. The pitch smelled green under the fat. He warmed a dab at the edge of the stove so it spread without tearing. He laid it along the cleaned furrow with a fingertip that had known lambs and broken tool handles. He packed gently where the skin made a pocket, then laid the folded flour sack strip across and bound it snug with a torn length of clean muslin. He knotted the bandage and tucked the end. Only then did he pull the blanket high again and cover her shoulder where the brand showed. He did it in one smooth motion that said nothing. Food, he said more to the air than to her. He set a small pot on the stove and dropped in 2 cuts of jerky, a pinch of salt, and a sprig of dried sage he kept in a tin. Water climbed to a simmer and threw up a clean smell that covered blood. He took the time to pick up the knife from the floor and wash it with hot water and a pinch of lye soap. He dried it with the tail of his shirt. When he turned, she was watching him. The fight that had lived in her eyes a moment ago had become something else, awaiting for terms that would cost more than coin. "Listen," he said. He hooked a thumb toward the door. 3 knocks is me, 2 is not. If you hear 2, you keep the bolt." Her lips parted, then closed. She nodded. The nod looked practiced, the way a stray dog nods at a bowl set down, and then looks to see if a boot follows. He ladled broth into the tin cup and carried it over. He crouched and held it for her until she took it. She drank small mouthfuls, and color came back in a faint ghost along her cheekbones. The heat put light in her eyes that was not fear. When the cup was half empty, he drew it away and set it near the stove to warm again. "Mason," she said, trying his name. He had not given it. She had seen it burned into the handle of the axe by the door. His initials met the grain there. He did not correct her. "Yes, if you want payment, say so." Her voice was flat as a quarry floor. The words had no room in them for hope or shame. They were the only kind she had been allowed to use. "I want you alive," he said. "That is the price I'm working for." Her eyes searched his face to find the trick in that. They found none now and did not trust the lack. She nodded again. He set his chair near the stove. He set the Winchester between the chair and the wall, butt down, barrel up. He moved the small wind chime from the eave hook and hung it inside on the nail near the door, so it would speak soft when the door stirred but not scream with the gale. He went to the jamb and rapped his knuckles 3 times, and then waited for silence. He said without looking over his shoulder, "Hear that and open. Hear anything else, do not." She closed her eyes. Her hand crept under the blanket and lay flat over the bandage as if to hold the skin together from the outside. Her breathing lost its fight and lengthened. The lines around her mouth softened until she almost looked like a dozing child. He saw then just how young she might be, too young to carry such marks. He let that thought pass through him and out to the wind. He lifted the brothy pot and poured a small cup for himself. It was thin and tasted of sage and salt and iron. It warmed his mouth and chest. He stood, went to the dry sink, and washed his hands in water he had warmed. The lye stung the raw split on his knuckle. He did not flinch. He crossed to the trunk under the window and set his palm on the lid. The wood held a little of the day's-old sun. Abigail's initials were there, A and H, intertwined, the A just a touch too tall. Inside lay things that belonged to a life that had stopped. He lifted the lid a thumb's width. The smell greeted him first, lavender and dust. Brass caught the lamplight within. He shut the lid and slid the latch home. He banked the stove, stirring ash to pull the coals together, then laid 2 small splits crosswise so the fire would not race. He looked once at the door and once at the bare window where the frost ferns had climbed. He took his chair and set it so that he could see both her face and the door without turning his head. He settled. The chair creaked and then accepted him. The rifle leaned where his hand could find it in the dark. On the rug, the girl shifted under the blanket and curled toward the heat. A tremor went through her, and then another. He rose and added a folded quilt beneath the blanket to trap the warmth. When he touched the edge of the wool, her hand jerked in sleep. He froze, waited, eased the quilt in place. "Rest," he said, very quiet. The word went nowhere but between them. Outside, the storm chewed at the little house until the timbers hummed. Inside, water ticked in the kettle, steady as a clock. The chime did not speak. Rosie in the lean-to let out a slow breath that fogged the cracks in the plank wall and then stood silent again. Mason folded the oiled rag, set it on the table, and closed his eyes without going to sleep. The body knows how to listen when it must. He listened to the line of her breathing and the small noises that belong to a house when it holds, and he kept the fire from going out. Night fell until the cabin was a small light in a white throat. The kettle ticked on the stove, the only sure measure of time. Nora slept, then shuddered awake, then fell again, the fever lifting her and dropping her like a rough hand. When the heat climbed, she talked to the dark. Names came first, hardly more than breath. Lily, Martha, Mama. Then pieces of room stairs, boots on wood, a curtain that hid sounds, but not the kind that mattered. Her hands flinched at ghosts no one else could see. The blanket rose and fell in a stutter. Mason wrung a cloth in hot water until it steamed and laid it on her forehead. He held it there while the heat fled the fabric and into her skin. He tipped a swallow of water against her mouth and watched for the swallow. When her jaw locked, he waited. When it loosened, he gave her more. He did not speak to soothe. He counted her breaths and listened for the ones that did not come easy. The wind kept up its work, pushing at the door until it groaned, then easing as if thinking of other doors to test. The little chime behind the nail clicked when the latch thought about moving. The click was a comfort because it meant the latch had not moved. Rosie stamped once in the lean-to and fell still again. In one of the near-dawn hours, the fever slid higher. Her skin was dry and hot, her eyes bright without focus. Sweat beaded at her temples and ran into her hair. She tried to throw the blanket off. He caught the edge and tucked it back, then pulled another quilt from his cot and laid it across her, careful not to weigh the bandage. Her body shivered under the heat. He held the cloth to her head and counted again. The wound told its own story. The bandage had drunk deep and turned brown at the center. The skin at the edge had reddened in a bright line. He took the strip away and cleaned again with hot water and soap, and that bought an hour, then another. He could feel the small breathing space open in the room when the smell of fresh water replaced the old iron stink. Sometime toward midday, she opened her eyes. The blue was back in them, thin but there. She squinted at the lamplight, then at him. She tried to sit and failed. He put his hand a handspan above her shoulder and said, "Quiet, stay." "Where am I?" she asked. Her voice was rough with sleep and fever. "San Luis," he said. "My place. You are inside a house. The storm is outside." She turned her face to the stove. The kettle hummed. The soft sound of sap hissing in the split peenon drifted across the floorboards. She let out a breath that had waited at the edge of her chest. "What is your name?" he asked. It was not his habit to ask. Names drag more than faces. She looked at the brand on her shoulder under the blanket and set her jaw. "Nora," she said after a pause. "Nora Quinn." He nodded. He did not give his then. She had already found it. Color had started to come back to her mouth, but her side had not settled the way it should. When she tried to roll, she made a tight sound and froze. The edges of the tear had lifted. He had hoped it would close on its own once the dirt left, but the fever had pulled the skin apart as she tossed. The pitch would not hold loose edges. They needed a few small stitches to bring skin to skin. He set the kettle forward and brought a little pan to a boil. He took a needle from Abigail's roll, the stout one he used on harness, cleaned it, then dropped it into the water. He set out new cloth and a spool of black thread that had served sheep coats, and the one winter he had sewed his own hand shut when a fence wire bit deeper than it should. He crouched by the rug. "I will stitch the cut," he said plain. "It will be quick and it will hurt." She looked at him. Her mouth was set, but a tremor ran through her. She nodded. He turned away and warmed his fingers over the stove. He wanted them to be steady. He strung the thread, drew it through the black eye, and tied a neat knot. He took the needle from the boil and dried it on a clean corner of cloth. "Lift the edge," he said. He took the blanket to her waist and stopped there. He folded the torn dress back with careful hands. He measured where the skin puckered and where it would meet if helped. He breathed. Then he put the needle through. She stiffened like a wire pulled taut. A sound left her that might have been a laugh if it had not broken in the middle. He set his palm against the blanket above her ribs so she had something to brace against and drew the thread through neat and even. 1, 2, 3, then the tie and a clip. He worked fast because slow would have been cruel. The wind pressed at the door in a slow heartbeat. The kettle sang one steady note. Her breath tried to fight him, then found his rhythm and took it in as her own. "Hold still," he said once because she had to hear something. He kept his eyes low on skin and thread, not on thigh, not on the turn of waist. He tied the last knot and clipped close. He smoothed the salve along the new seam with a gentle finger, then laid a clean bandage and snugged it down. When he drew the blanket back over her, she had tears on her face. They stood in her lashes like frost on a fence wire. She blinked them away and set her mouth like she was holding a coin under her tongue. "Done," he said. She nodded again once. Her hand went to the bandage not to touch, just to confirm that skin lay flat now. The pain had changed. It was cleaner. He stood and moved to the stove. He dropped a thin slice of jerky in the pot and watched the broth thicken just enough to pass for food. He set a bit of salt on his palm, then let it fall into the water. He found a heel of cornbread in a tin and warmed it on the back of the stove until the crust crisped. He brought the cup to her and held it while she sipped. The salt sat right on her tongue and woke her mouth. He broke the crust and handed her a small piece. She took it with careful fingers and ate like someone who remembered rules about rationing and who might come to take the rest. He set the rest of the bread by the pot and did not touch it again so that she could see it would be there. Outside, the wind slowed for a time. Snow sifted against the window in a fine grain. The chime gave a soft, single click when the door settled back into its frame. The house felt less like a boat and more like a room. "Thank you," she said. The words were new in her mouth, too big for the space they were given. He shrugged one shoulder. "Keep the blanket up. If you sweat through, tell me." She looked down at the wool tucked to her chin, then at his chair by the stove. "You do not sleep," she said. "I will take the chair," he said. "It is near the fire. I keep it going." She let her eyes move to the cot against the wall, and then back to the chair, and then to him. She did not ask a question, but he answered anyway. "You take the bed," he said. She lay back and watched the ceiling. The lamplight picked out the seams in the planks. The smell of sage and pine pitch hung in the warm air. She breathed once deep and slow, and then again. The fever had not left, but it had stepped back from the brink and looked over its shoulder. Mason banked the fire for the afternoon. He hung the damp cloths on a line between two nails near the stove. He cleaned the pan and the needle and set them on the trunk to cool. He checked the door, then the window, then the chime. He sat. The chair took his weight with a small sound, then went still. Nora turned toward the heat and closed her eyes. Her face almost looked young when the muscles let go. Her hands lay above the blanket where he could see them empty palm up. He watched until her breath fell into the slow, even kind that makes the body fit back into itself. He let his own lungs match hers. The room held. The storm gnawed at the eaves and then rested. The kettle whispered. The mule in the lean-to shifted and sighed. In the small house at the edge of the white, a man kept a fire and a woman slept. The first sign was not sun, but the quiet. The wind stepped away from the house and the boards let go a long-held breath. Frost feathered the window until it looked like a frozen fern. The little chime on the nail did not move. Mason stood from the chair, checked the banked coals, and set the kettle forward until it sang again. "Stay put," he said. "Bolt behind me. 3 knocks is me." Nora pulled the blanket to her throat and nodded. Her eyes were clear with a thin kind of light. He lifted the latch, slipped out, and dropped the bar on the outside. Cold took his teeth in one bite. Snow lay in piled backs against the eaves, blue at the edges under the new day. His boots sank to the ankle, then to the shin where the drifts had heaped, and then he found the hard crust higher up. The air had the taste of iron and distant pine. He waded to the rise behind the house. Each step squeaked in the bitter cold and left a clean punch in the white. He set his feet in the old tracks he had carved between storms and climbed until the cabin looked like a toy someone had forgotten. He stood with his hands on his hips and let his breath go in a white rope. The valley was a dish, ringed by the sangres cut hard and sharp as hammered glass. All that moved was a far ribbon of smoke to the south, and a scatter of dark seeds working a ridgeline beyond it. Not a camp. A search line spread wide and careful. He watched until it made its own answer in his chest. He turned and went down a longer stride than he had taken up. He set his palm against the door and knocked 3 times, then pressed in as Nora slid the bolt. He shut the cold out with his shoulder and leaned his back to the wood. "What is it?" she asked, voice low as if not to wake the day. "Riders," he said, "a line of them, fanned out and patient." Her throat moved. She watched him see her without blinking. The blanket around her shoulders rose and fell on a slow breath. He crossed to the stove, set his hands near the heat, then reached for the kettle and poured water into the tin cup. He set it in her hands. "They will sweep the ridges," he said. "They will not hurry. They do not need to. Tracks up here will hold." She drank and nodded. The nod was not fear. It was recognition, like counting beats in a song she already knew. He drew a chair close but sat on its edge. "Tell me," he said, not with demand, and not with softness. So, I can understand what is at my door. She looked at the blanket and then at the stove. Her gaze climbed to the place where the brand lay under wool, then away. She traced a seam in the rug with one finger, a slow line, and began. Blue Jay House in Pueblo, she said. They call the debt work. They call the auctions punishment. They call a judge's money clean if he takes the paper first. Judge Hollis Crow. Sheriff Pike Rollins carries the paper. Sheriff says the county gets tidy when girls go quiet. They sell the quiet. The names hung in the warm air and shifted the room. Mason did not move. She breathed and went on. Lily was 15. She did not know the tricks or the rules. She cried. They hit her and told her to smile. Crow wanted the new one first. He tore her mouth when she tried to cover it. There was blood. I had a knife in the mattress seam. I tried his heart and missed his shoulder by a finger. He screamed. Rollins was in the hall. He dragged me down the stairs and said the town would watch me learn my place. She stopped and swallowed. The kettle hummed. Sap cracked in the pinon and sent a little sweet smoke into the corner of the room. He could see her hands shake and watched her hold them still. You ran, he said. I went through a window, she said. They shot. One kissed me here. She touched the blanket lightly at her side. I kept going. Snow took my feet. I thought it would take me whole. He let air move in his chest. Crow will have friends. Rollins will have a posse and a warrant and a pocket full of words that sound like law. Her mouth made a small smile with no joy in it. They have those. He stood and crossed to the peg by the door. He took down a heavy coat and shook it. He reached under the bed and pulled out a small oiled cloth packet and set it on the table. He unrolled it to a short pistol, a .32 with a shaved grip and clean action. He broke it open, checked the rounds, and closed it with a neat click. This is yours, he said. He held it out grip first. Do not show it until you must. Do not use it unless they touch you. She looked at the pistol, then at him. Her fingers hovered in the air, then closed on the grip. She checked the cylinder without looking at her hand. The move was sure and quick. All the talk had said less than that one neat check. Magistrate Sutter at Silver Gulch will hear you, he said. The words felt like rocks he had lifted and found rotten wood underneath. He holds court mornings in the saloon. If there is one man in reach who will put a mark on a paper for what you have to say, it is him. What do you think he will call me? She asked. The question was flat. Witness or property? I think he will show his colors, Mason said. I think we need him to show them. She pulled the blanket tighter and waited. He nodded once, a small thing, and went to the lean-to. Rosie lifted her head and blew at his coat. He rubbed the soft nose and felt the old breath warm his palm. In the back stall, the bay gelding rolled an eye and stamped. Mason haltered both. He took time to check the straps and run a hand down each leg. The habit steadied his fingers. He saddled the bay and threw a folded blanket and a light sawbuck on Rosie so she could carry what a mule carries best. He hung a water bag and tied off a bundle of dried meat and a small sack of parched corn. He slid his Winchester into a scabbard and tied a coil of rope to the rear ring. Inside, Nora had dressed herself in a shirt he kept for chores and a pair of wool trousers that bent to her with room to spare. She had braided her wet hair back from her face and tied it with a strip of cotton. The bandage under the fabric pulled a little, and he watched the pain slide under her eyes, then settle. You ride the mule, he said. She stepped steady even when a drift looks like sky. Nora nodded. He wrapped her in his second coat and tied a scarf across her mouth and nose until only her eyes showed. He pushed the door with his shoulder, and the cold came in again, clean and bright. He stepped out and helped her through and set her foot in the stirrup. She swung up slow, testing the pull at her side, then settled with a grit of teeth that did not ask for notice. He mounted the bay and let him dance a step, then stand. The world had gone to sparkle and shadow. Every fence post wore a white cap. The cottonwoods by the half-frozen creek bowed under weight. A raven crossed the field and left a wavering shadow on the snow, like ink dissolving in water. Hold the scarf, he said. Breathe slow. Speak if the stitches pull too hard. She set her hand where the bandage lay and nodded. He clicked once to the bay and set them moving. The mule followed. The path out of the yard had drifted over, and he broke it with the gelding's chest. Snow dust flying. The house shrank behind them to a square with smoke rising straight in the cold. The chime did not speak. The whole valley listened. They took the long line between fences and moved toward the road that would find Silver Gulch, where it ran against the lower hills. Steel shoes bit into the crust with a sound like cracked glass. Nora kept her eyes up and forward and set her jaw against the ache that traveled with every step. Her hands rode light on the reins. She sat as if she had learned on a borrowed horse and had been told not to make it her own. Mason watched the line of the southern ridge when he did not watch her. The smoke he had seen from the rise had thinned in the full day. That meant nothing he cared to trust. Tracks ran like old scars across the snow, where deer had crossed before the storm. A coyote had written a curving story down toward the draw and away. No fresh men sign lay across the road yet. He let the bay stretch into a careful walk that would last. The cold ate sound. Their small noises seemed to go only as far as their own breath. At the edge of the creek they stopped to water. He broke the ice with a heel and made a hole big enough for a horse nose and a mule nose. The bay drank and blew. Rosie took her turn and stood with lower lip dripping. Mason cupped water to his own mouth and tasted clean cold. Nora leaned down, filled her palm, and sipped until color came back into her lips. When she looked up, her eyes had gone sharp again. Not fever, not panic. A set like someone who had put her back to a door and decided to hold it. They climbed out and took the road proper. The sun hung pale behind thin cloud, a coin through milk. Mason kept them to the right, where the banks held and where the drifts had left a shoulder. Trees threw bars of shade that slid over their faces and backs. Far ahead, the darker line of the town road cut across the white toward a low notch in the hills. No one spoke for a time. The work of riding in the cold and the care it took had its own speech. When Nora did talk, it was to say only one thing. "Do not leave me at the door," she said. "Stand where he can see you when I speak." Mason met her eyes with his and nodded. The rest was the sound of iron on ice and the soft grunt of a mule that knew the way of winter. Silver Gulch showed itself in angles and steam. Snow shoveled from rooftops lay in clean ridges along boardwalks. Smoke walked straight up into the pale sky from stovepipes. A blacksmith swung a hammer and made a hard bell of morning. The street opened like a throat toward the low hills. At its center stood the copper lantern red paint dulled by cold, and years' batwing doors flapping slow as breath. Mason reined the bay and let him stand for a count steam lifting off his neck. Rosie planted herself with the stubborn square set that made mules useful. Nora sat easy in the saddle and watched the wind move sawdust under the saloon doors. Her scarf hid all but her eyes. "Loosen the scarf in there," Mason said. "Hot room." She pulled the fabric down and tucked it into the collar. Her mouth had color again. The line in her jaw had come back and set, like iron, cooled true. He swung down first, tied the bay to the rail, then took Rosie's rein and made fast. He reached up, offered a hand. She ignored the hand and found the stirrup herself, then eased to the ground in a controlled slide. The movement pulled at her side. She held herself still until the pinch went soft. They crossed the boardwalk. The batwings pushed warm air into their faces, thick with beer-sour tobacco sweet and the fat smoke of frying salt pork. A one-eyed man at the upright piano was coaxing out a crooked tune. Cards whispered on felt at 3 tables. Men looked up and let their eyes do the measure they always did. The tune fell apart. The piano man lifted his hands and sat back. Mason kept going as if the music still played. He felt the old floor give under his boots in the places where it always had. He did not look left or right. He went to the back where a table held a half-empty whiskey, a book of accounts with a stub pencil, and a big man in a vest the color of red wine gone wrong. Magistrate Sutter had a face built for scowling and an appetite for it. The wet shine on his bottom lip said he had started his 10 o'clock early. At his right shoulder sat Deputy Wynne, narrow and eager jaw, tight as a knot. A second deputy, Clary, leaned against the wall, boots hooked on a chair rung, thumb riding the strap of his holster. Sutter, Mason said. He let the name settle. "She has a statement to make. We are here for the law." The magistrate looked at Mason, then let his gaze slide to Nora and stay there. His eyes took a slow walk over her, catching on coat seams on cheap cloth, made clean on the way she stood without leaning on the table edge. They did not care for the standing. His lip curled. "What you have is a runaway," he said. "What you have is property." Nora stepped forward until her knee brushed the table and met his eyes straight on. "My name is Nora Quinn," she said. "Simple the way one sets a post deep, so it will hold when the soil moves. I am here to lodge charges against Judge Hollis Crow of Pueblo County and Sheriff Pike Rawlins of Las Almas County. Assault, trafficking, conspiracy, rape." The words landed like coins. The men in the room did not reach for them. Sutter's face went purple at the edges, and then dark. He laughed short and mean. "Charges," he said. "You stand in here looking like that, and you say charges against men who serve. Crow is a judge of standing. Rollins is an officer elected by good men who pay their taxes. You are a debt. You have a brand to prove it." Clary's boot scraped the floor. Someone at the bar cleared his throat and tried to turn it into a laugh. Wynn lifted his chin and let his hand sit on his hip, not quite touching his gun. Mason watched the hand and not Sutter's mouth. He felt the room pull in. Nora's hand came up fast and clean. The slap was a sharp crack that cut through beer and smoke and talk. Sutter's cheek bloomed red. His head snapped to the side, then back. Shock made his mouth round. He reached for his glass and found only table. His voice went high before it dropped to a bark. "Arrest her," he said. "Arrest them both." Wynn was already up. He reached for the Winchester at Mason's shoulder. Mason did not lift the rifle. He turned his body and brought the butt around in a short arc. The oiled wood found Wynn's jaw with a thud that had teeth in it. The deputy went down on his knees with his hands at his face, blood threading past his fingers. Clary moved at the same time. He came off the wall and swept Nora from behind one arm, binding across her throat, and the other catching her wrist. She twisted against him and found his forearm with her teeth. He yelped, let go a fraction, then threw her. She hit the floor hard. The sawdust cushioned some, not her knee. Pain flared along the joint, and she bit it back. The room roaring in her ears was not the bar. It was a staircase in another building, boots and laughter, and a velvet curtain. She fixed her eyes on the knotwork of the table leg and came back into the room she was in. "Gun," someone said in a strangled voice that might have been Wynn's. "Gun." Mason held the Winchester low and did not aim it at a man. He lifted it and fired once at the ceiling. The shot tore a hole in plaster and spit dust and lath splinters down like snow. Men dove for cover by habit, not by thought. The bartender hit the floor. Sutter crouched and clutched his cheek. The piano man slid off the bench and under his instrument. Clary flinched and dropped his hand from his holster. "Back," Mason said, voice calm and big enough to fill the room without shouting. "Stay where you are." He reached for Nora with his left hand, fingers finding her upper arm. He pulled her up and set her on her feet, without looking away from the room. He kept the Winchester between his chest and every set of eyes. She steadied on her bad knee and grabbed the edge of the table when the room tilted, then let go and stood under herself. "Out," he said to her. They turned together. No one rushed them. Wynn groaned and spat something onto the floor that knocked against a tooth. Sutter straightened slowly, one hand on the red bloom of his cheek, the other pointing like a man who had just remembered he was supposed to control things. "You are done here, Hale," he said. "You bring a branded girl into my court and raise a rifle at my deputies. You will not see the day out." Mason did not give him the courtesy of an answer. He shouldered through the batwings and into a street that had stopped to listen. A teamster paused with a sack over his shoulder. A woman at the general store door turned her face away and pulled her shawl up. Boys on a roof with shovels leaned on their handles and stared. The blacksmith's hammer found metal and then halted midair. Mount Mason said. He reached for Rosie's rein and shoved a boot into the stirrup to brace. Nora put a hand on the horn and launched herself up. The knee barked again. She sat it out with a deep breath that set her side to throbbing. He swung into the bay and spun him with his knee. A shot cracked from inside. The board in front of the general store jumped and spit a splinter into the street. Clary was late and wide. Mason did not turn his head. He put his heels to the bay and set him moving. He took Rosie's lead in his left hand and let the mule's weight tug at his shoulder as she found her stride. They ran the length of the street between two thin lines of faces. A crate fell from a cart and broke apart onions rolling along the gutter like green stones. A dog barked once and fled. A boy who had raised his hand to point let it drop. Men who had reached for pistols found they did not need them and were slow to put them away. Nora's coat flapped and filled with wind. The scarf at her neck snapped and settled. She sat tight eyes forward, breath loud in her own ears. The road fell away from town. The first line of houses blurred into snow and brush, and then nothing but drift and fence and distance. Mason did not look back, but he felt the eyes peel off them as they crossed the last plank of the bridge over the creek. The bay's stride lengthened and found the winter pace that could carry him for hours if asked. Rosie came on after ears forward, feet sure, even as planks slid under thin ice. A second shot sounded faint behind them and hit nothing. The cold ate the crack. They topped a low rise and the valley opened. The sky had cleared to a washed blue, high and empty. The sangres carved themselves out of it in hard lines. The sun fell on the white and threw light up into their faces. Nora's knee throbbed, and then settled into a steady ache that she could ride above. Her side tugged at the seam he had sewn and held. She set her hand there once and pressed and felt the line hold under her palm. Breath in, breath out. The fear that had been a living animal in her chest had curled in on itself and gone still. Not gone. Set aside for the work of motion. Mason kept the bay at a pace that made room in the lungs and in the head. He rode the edge of the packed road where the crust took a shoe. His eyes went over the fence lines, the cuts in the snow where wind had gnawed the pale shadow of a hawk sliding across the white. He listened for hooves behind them and heard only their own. At a stand of willows by the creek, he cut them left and took a ranch track that ran narrow between old stone walls. The drift across it had a crust thick enough to hold if a hoof came down clean. The bay tested it, found it, and pushed through. Rosie placed every foot with the caution of a banker and made it look like grace. They reached a gap where a gate had hung once and now was only two standing posts charred black years ago. Mason slowed the bay to a walk and let his shoulders drop a fraction. He turned in the saddle and looked at Nora's face. Her skin had chapped across the cheekbones. Her eyes sat steady and bright. "Hurting," he said. "Enough," she said. It was true and did not ask sympathy. He nodded and faced forward. The breath from both horses smoked and then was gone. A raven crossed above them and croaked as if remarking on their smallness. It went on. The track bent north and found an old wagon rut polished by ice. The bay took it and made it a road. Rosie's halter rope tugged with a comfort in it, now a shared weight. They moved until the town and its walls and its faces and the plank floor and the red cheek were all a flat place behind them. The snow had the look it gets when wind stops, and the world waits to see what steps will be laid down on it next. The sound of a bell drifted from somewhere far and thin, maybe the blacksmith marking a job done, maybe a church finding its hour. It thinned in the clear air and went away. They rode on. They came into the home valley late, the light thin and slant. Mason felt the change before he saw it. The air was wrong, heavier, sour on the back of the tongue. Snow glared clean over the flats, but a dark plume stood where no plume should stand. Not the tight gray of a stove. This was black with oil in it, and a bitter edge that clung to the nose. He put the bay into a careful trot. Nora set her weight and let Rosie match the mule's ears pricked forward. The cabin rose out of the drift like a square jaw. The barn did not rise at all. Char and ribs of timber stood like the bones of a hand. Smoke dribbled from the heap and went straight up into the cold. Mason drew up at the yard and swung down. He smelled soaked ash and a sweet, sick note under it, like meat that never met a pan. Snow around the barn had melted and refrozen to a glass crust. A trail of wide boot prints circled the ruin and led away to the south fence. The gate hung open. The rope that had held it lay in a frozen S. "Stay a seat," he said without looking at Nora. She dismounted anyway, slow and stiff, and came to the edge of the black. The heat off the ashes licked at their shins. A beam folded inside. A flock of starlings lifted from the cottonwoods and turned as one, their wings a soft hiss. The cabin door had taken an axe. Deep bites scarred the plank around the latch. A strip of paper was nailed to the center of the door with a horseshoe nail. Mason reached and tore it free. The charcoal letters were jagged and hard. Hand over the J. He crushed the paper and kept his hand closed. The fist felt like a rock in winter. Inside the cabin, the air was colder than it should have been. The fire had gone out, the wood box had been kicked over, and two sticks lay on the floor like bones. Nothing was taken. A tin plate lay face down, a chair on its side. The trunk by the window sat where it always sat. Dust on the lid wore a new finger track across Abigail and Hale. Someone had touched and moved on. Nora went to the rug. She knelt, one hand pressed to her side. Her eyes found the little wind chime on the nail, and held there as if to tell herself there were still rules inside these walls. Mason set the crushed paper on the table and crossed to the back door. He opened it a hand's width and smelled the well. Lye stung the nose. He went out and kicked the crust from the rope bucket. He hauled. The rope came up stiff with cold and weight. The bucket broke the skin of the water and rolled. It came over the lip with a slop of white cloud and a sheen on top that caught the light. A dead jackrabbit bumped the iron rim and turned belly-swollen fur slicked. The stink pushed at him chemical and rot. He dumped the bucket with both hands and let the mess splash across the snow. The film spread and made a rainbow that had no business in winter. He sent the bucket down again and heard it knock the well stones. He did not pull. He tied it off and left it to swing and bump in the dark. Back inside, he crouched at the stove and stirred the ash until he found a live coal. He coaxed a curl of pine with his breath and watched a small flame catch. He fed it dry slivers, then 2 short splits. Heat came back into the iron slow and sure. The room took it in. Nora stood with her fingers on the axe marks in the door. She traced one groove and then the other, then let her hand fall. Her face had gone to that plain set he was learning, the one that held back what had no room to come out here. "I will go," she said. "They want me. If I leave, they stop at your fence." He moved in 2 steps. He did not take her shoulders this time. He put his hands on the table and breathed once through his nose. When he looked up, there was no heat in it, only stone. "They burned my barn," he said. "They broke my door. They fouled my water. They nail words to my house and think a nail can hold me. This is my fence, not theirs." She turned her face toward the window. Her reflection lay there in the faint light, small against the frost fern. The scarf at her neck was stained with smoke from the saloon ceiling. She pulled it off and folded it once, then again set it on the chair and sat. He took the axe from its peg and went out to the woodpile. The split rounds were iced on the top and grained dark where the last blade had cut. He set one on the stump and raised the axe. The swing dropped clean. The wood opened with a report. He set another and another. The rhythm took hold. Thud, thud. The crisp echo came back from the hills. When his breath made a cloud that hung in front of his face and froze on his beard, he stopped. He carried an armload inside and stacked it by the stove crossways so air could move. Nora had the pot up and water working toward a boil. She had swept the floor and set the fallen chair against the table again. The wind chime clicked once when the door settled. "I need water," he said. "The well is a grave. I will go to the Pratt place." Nora watched him pull on his coat. Her eyes flicked to the window and then back to him. She did not speak. He lifted the Winchester from the corner where it stood and checked the gate on the tube. He slid 2 more rounds into the magazine and thumbed the spring until it seated. He set his hat and went out. The Pratt Ranch sat 5 miles east over a low ridge where the sage runs thin. Mason kept the bay at a trot that did not waste him. The cold had hardened the road and made iron ring on it. The light lay low and sharp and turned the snowscape to bone and silver. He saw Raven's sign along the fence. He saw one set of fresh prints crossing his path, 3 men on shod horses heading south. He did not turn his head to follow them. Jonah Pratt met him on the porch with a rifle in his hands and a face that had forgotten how to smile. Dell stood 2 steps behind him, her mouth align, her apron still flour on the front, Jonah Mason said. He kept his hands down and open. "I need water. They fouled my well." "You should not be here," Jonah said. He tipped the rifle a hair without pointing it. "Men coming through asking. Rollins himself was at my gate. He burned my barn," Mason said. "He nailed a note to my door and poisoned my hole. I need a barrel and a side of bacon. I will pay when the road opens." Dell's eyes slid to the edge of the porch where the drift began. "Who have you got in that cabin, Mason Hale?" she asked. Her voice had weight in it. "A woman," he said. "Hurt." Dell's mouth pinched. "The one with the mark," she said. "We hear things. A blue jay and a star. You bringing that into our valley. Shame on you." Mason felt the skin along his jaw tighten. "She has a name," he said. "So does the law," Jonah said. "It has your name now." Sutter sent Wynn out with a paper. "They say you raised a rifle in his court. They say she struck an officer. They say you brought a brand into town and told it to talk. You can ride back the way you came. Do not bring them to my fence. I got a boy in his bed and a wife in my doorway. That is what I have to keep." Mason stood and listened to the wind run across the rise behind the house. He looked at Jonah's hands on the rifle. They were steady. He looked at Dell's eyes. They were afraid and something else he did not speak to. He turned his hat a fraction on his head and lifted his chin. "I will go," he said. "I will remember." He put his boot in the stirrup and swung up. The bay gathered himself and moved. He did not look back at the porch. He felt the door shut behind him, the way you feel a frost go through a fence line. The sound is small, but it changes the field. He reached the ridge at the edge of his land as the sun brushed the range. His valley lay under it, white and blue and black where the barn had been. Smoke from the cabin stove made a straight thread. The wind had come back in a little enough to push the chime on the nail and make it click once and then stop. Inside, Nora had the stove hot, and the room above freezing. She had set the rug straight and wiped the table with a clean rag. She watched him close the door and take in the room with a single sweep. "They said no," she said. "It was not a question. They said no," he said. He leaned the rifle in its place and put both hands on the back of the chair as if to hold it still. He stood that way for a long count. He breathed like a man who had run though he had not. Nora's mouth parted. "I can go to them," she said. "I can walk to their line and put my hands out. You can tell them I came at you with a knife. You can keep your land. You can rebuild what they broke." Mason lifted his eyes and looked at her until she had to meet them. He did not move for some time. When he spoke, the words came measured and low, the way he spoke to a skittish colt that had stepped wrong and stood on a wire. "No," he said. "You walked to my door. I carry what that costs." He turned and crossed to the trunk under the window. He put his palm on the lid and felt the faint warmth of the room there. He lifted the latch and raised the lid enough to see brass and wood and the neat rolls of linen lavender faint under the dust. He set the lid down gentle and sat on the edge of the cot. He did not look at Nora and did not look at the door. He looked at the stove as if it were a thing that might lose its mind if he did not tend it. She stood and moved to the fire. The bandage tugged at her side. She hid the wince and fed in a small split and then another. The flame caught and licked up the face of the wood and made new light across the floorboards. Mason rose, took the axe to the wood box, and went out again. The yard lay hard and cold. He set around on the stump and brought the blade down. The sound was clean. The rhythm came back. Thud, thud. The light left the snow in a slow fade. The axe head flashed and fell and flashed again. The sound went to the hills and came back thinner. In the kitchen glow behind him, Nora moved through the small motions that keep a room human. A pot lifted and settled. A cup touched wood with a flat note. Cloth hissed through water. The chime clicked once and went still. The house gathered itself tight against the dark. Night deepened until the windows turned to black slate. The stove glowed a dark red and threw a circle of steady heat. Mason split a last armful and stacked it so the ends made a checker for air. Inside, Nora wiped the table hard enough to raise grain, then folded the rag and set it by the dry sink. When she straightened her eyes, went to the trunk. "Does it work?" she asked. "It did," Mason said. He set the axe by the door and crossed to the window. The latch on the trunk clicked under his thumb. The smell inside was lavender and dust. Brass lay cushioned in linen. He lifted the graphophone by its base, set it on the table, and turned it so the horn could drink the room. He took a small key from the box and wound the spring until he felt resistance. The cylinder in the cut velvet sat blank and smooth, a pale brown with the sheen of old wax. Nora stood close enough to see the needle. Steam from the kettle fogged the lower pane. The little chime on the nail gave one small click. "If he hears I am alone and ready to plead," she said voice level, "he will come to count his victory. He will talk." Mason looked at her. "There is a man who can carry a word to him without bringing a line of riders." "Who?" she said. "Buck McCrae," Mason said. "He traps the North Draw. He sells pelts to whoever pays. He likes coin more than anyone's good opinion." Nora watched his hands find the wax cylinders and count them with his eyes. 5. She touched the tip of one with her finger and drew back at the cool feel. "Tell him I am here," she said. "Tell him I will surrender to Rollins and to him alone." Mason set the lid back on the cylinder case. "He will pay for that message with a look through my window." "Let him," she said. "We are past hiding." Snow fell by fits in the hours before dawn, a sift that added nothing, and made each shadow look like a print. Mason saddled the bay and went out with the rifle under his coat. He cut along the cottonwoods low and slow until the trees cloaked him from the south line. The world was crisp, and every step made a clear note. He saw no men's sign that mattered. 2 owls traded a call across the gulch. Buck's lean-to crouched under a rock shelf. Smoke stood thin in the morning air. Mason stopped outside and whistled 2 notes he had used years ago when Buck's snares had taken rabbits from his fence line and a talk had been needed. The flap shifted. Buck looked out with eyes like a fox and a grin that never meant comfort. "You look cold," Buck said. "Message," Mason said. He unbuttoned his coat enough to take out a roll of notes and held them flat so the count showed. "For Rollins. The girl he wants is at my cabin. She will open the door for him and no other." Buck's eyes went to the money, then back to Mason's face. "Alone," he said. "Alone," Mason said. "He wants his own version of the truth to tell. He will come to get it." Buck took the money and palmed it away. "You are a strange man," he said. "Do you have the legs?" Mason said. "I travel when the coin is warm," Buck said. He ducked back, came out with a fur cap, and swung a saddle onto a thin roan. "If he rides, he will be in your yard by lights out." Mason set his jaw. He watched Buck ride for the south fence until the roan was a cut in white. He went home under the cottonwoods and kept to the shallow places. They set the room. Mason pried up the board that covered the cellar mouth and cleared the steps. He nested the Winchester at the level of a man's chest, standing at the stove and sighted along the seam of light that the crack in the flooring left. He set the board back and left a corner loose. Nora watched face still. She moved the table so the horn of the graphophone pointed toward the place where the visitor would stand to warm his hands. They tested the spring with nothing on the cylinder. Mason started the turn, and the machine whispered a dry little hum, a cricket's chorus caught in a pipe. Nora said her name into the horn as soft as a prayer, and Mason lifted the needle clear. He spun it back and set it again. It gave back a ghost that sounded like wind in another room, and the faint shape of her name. That was enough to say the wax would take a man's voice. Nora set the 32 where her hand could find it. She tucked it into the waistband under the shirt, then drew the coat over it. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and let it ride low so it would not catch. The bandage pulled when she breathed. She kept her hand off the wound and made herself a small shape the way the world had trained her to do. It felt like swallowing a stone. Mason looked at her. She looked back and did not blink. He went down the steps into the cellar and set his shoulder under the beam so it would not creak if he shifted weight. He put the barrel on the joist and breathed through his mouth. Late light took the edge of the hills and turned them blue. The cold came through the planks at Nora's feet. She lit the lamp and set it high so the horn caught the glow. She checked the salve lid with a fingertip, as if a stranger might believe she had been tending a wound. She stood where one arm's reach would touch the handle of the door bolt. The chime hung quiet. A horse came in slow and steady and stopped where a man could watch the door and the back window at the same time. The rider dismounted without a jingle. He let the reins fall. The knock that came was not a knock. It was a boot heel in the wood, one hit to see if the bar was set. Nora slid the bolt and opened a hand's width. The door pushed past her palm, and Rollins filled the space with the cold, and his breath and the weight of his coat. He shut the door with his heel and set his gloves on the table, as if he had come home. Melted snow beads glittered on his mustache. The liquor on his breath was rye with a harsh nail in it. "Well now," he said. He stretched his hands toward the stove and watched the steam rise off the leather. "You finally decided to stop running." Nora pulled the shawl close and made her voice small. "Please," she said, "take me back to the house in Pueblo. Do not take me to the jail. I will work off what I owe if you keep me from the rope." Rollins laughed low in his chest. "Rope," he said. "There are many ways for a day to go wrong before a rope comes into it. A judge has needs, a sheriff has duties, a town wants quiet, and a church wants men clean on Sundays. We all get what we want if the paper says the right thing." He turned his head and looked around the cabin with the slow care of a thief and a man who has been invited to steal. His eyes skated over the trunk and the lamp and the gun rack. He did not see the machine for what it was. He stepped to the stove and took the cup Nora had left there and sniffed it like a dog at a pan. He put it down and smiled at her, with his eyes on her mouth. "You think I did not know where you would go?" he said. "The snow makes a map. I can read a boot the same as I can read a prayer. That man of yours with the quiet face should have kept you shut tight in his house and prayed the thaw would take you both." "I am not," as Nora said, barely sound. "You are mine on paper," Rollins said. He took a half step, "and on the brand." Nora worked her hands together as if to warm them. "Judge Hollis Crow," she said, eyes down. "He paid to do what he did to the girl." "Lily, you said so." Rollins smirked. "A judge pays his share like any man who wants something kept to his own. Men who hear cases do not mean they stop being men. My office makes sure a debt keeps its shape. I take what is owed to the county, and a fee for the sheriff, and a fee for friends. There are men in 3 counties who sleep better because I carry the paper." The horn drank it all. The wax turned under the needle and took a forest of tiny lines that would be a voice later. The machine had a small hum. Rollins heard nothing but himself. "Please," Nora said, and she made it sound like a door giving in. "I am cold. I will not run if you let me sit." He came to her and set his hand in her hair and tightened his fist until it hurt. He watched her eyes for the flinch and smiled when he found it. The lamplight cut his face into planes and shadow. His coat hung open. The butt of his revolver showed plain above his belt. The floorboard lifted and hit the underside of the table, a single fast shove from below. The graphophone rocked, but stayed where it sat. The needle ticked and skated a hair, then found the groove again. "Hands off her," Mason said. His voice came from the dark of the cellar from the open plank, like the low note from a big drum. He rose through the gap and took the room like a storm takes a fence. The Winchester's sight sat on the place where a man's heart lives. Rollins flinched and pulled Nora hard, turning her like a door between him and the gun. His other hand went for his holster by thieves' reflex. He was fast in the way all men who live by pulling iron get fast. Nora did not pull away from his grip. She twisted into it, turning her body sideways and up, and her right hand found the butt of the .32 in the crease of her coat. The metal was cold, and then it was nothing but weight and purpose. She drew and brought it up under Rollins's arm close enough that the wool of his coat brushed her knuckles. The shot was a flat slap in the small room. The muzzle flashed through a harsh picture of them all on the wall and took it back. Rollins's body jerked. His mouth made a shape that never found sound. He let go of Nora's hair and sagged. The smell of powder rushed out and sat heavy as a cloth. Mason moved in 2 long steps and took Rollins by the wrist and rolled him away from Nora. He kicked the revolver across the room, where it hit the baseboard, and stopped. Rollins looked up at the ceiling, as if there were words written there he had meant to read. Blood soaked his vest and spread in a quick heat that turned dark at the edges. His chest rose twice and then did not rise again. Silence grew until the tick of the graphophone's gear sounded like a clock in an empty church. Nora stood with the pistol in her hand, arms still extended. The tremor came into her elbow, then her shoulder. Mason took the gun and put it on the table and closed her hand around the edge so her fingers had wood to feel. "It is done," he said. He crouched and set 2 fingers to Rollins's neck where a pulse should live. There was nothing but warmth on the skin, and then not even that. He stood and went to the machine. He lifted the needle and the cylinder and held the wax like an egg. He set it in the cradle of a folded towel. He took the key and stopped the spring. The room listened to itself. Nora's breath came back to her in slow draws. Her hair had a rough stripe where his hand had pulled. She touched that place and then dropped her hand like she had touched a stove lid. "Did it take his voice?" she asked. The words were barely above a whisper. Mason set the cylinder down with care and turned the crank 1 small turn. He placed the needle-guided the horn close and let the machine speak. The sound came up out of scratches and gave them back what had been said minutes before. Not perfect, not pretty, but clear enough to put a name to a man. "Men in 3 counties sleep better because I carry the paper." He lifted the needle and the words cut off. He wrapped the cylinder in a square of linen and tied it with a shoelace. His hands did not shake. Nora sat on the chair with her palms flat and her eyes on the rug. The bandage under her shirt tugged with each breath, but it held. Her face had lost what color the stove had given it. She was very still. Mason crossed to her and set 1 hand on the back of the chair. He did not touch her hair or her shoulder. He stood and let the room learn to hold both of them again. The stove burned clean. The cold pressed at the seams. The little chime did not move. On the floor, the sheriff lay where he had fallen. The machine on the table went quiet with the spring spent. The only sound was the slow tick of iron cooling in the stove, and the small sound of cloth as Nora's hands finally closed and opened once on the chair's edge. Mason wound linen around the wax and tied it with a bootlace. He tucked the bundle into Abigail's shawl, as if heat could seep through wool into a thing that did not feel. He set the graphophone back in the trunk and closed the lid until the latch clicked. Nora stood by the chair with her hands flat on the table. Rollins lay where the floor had taken him. Mason drew the blanket from the cot and covered the face. He did not say a prayer. He took the saddlebag from its hook and opened the door. Cold swept the room. The little chime stirred once and fell silent. Outside, the stars were hard and the snow gave off a pale light of its own. Mason saddled the bay and cinched tight. He slung the saddlebag and put his hand to it once to feel the shape of the cylinder under cloth. Nora pulled his spare coat across her shoulders and buttoned it wrong, at first, then set the buttons true. She took Rosie's lead and stepped up into the winter night without looking back. They moved southeast, the kind of line a man draws when the ground he knows has turned against him. The creek cut a path where willows bent with ice. The bay took the shallows, water breaking and refreezing on his fetlocks. Rosie followed with calm steps, ears forward, breath smoking. The first mile had the noise of hooves on crust and leather shift. After that, sound flattened to breath and the far, thin ring of frost. They did not touch the road to Silver Gulch. Mason held to the low ground where a man could not be seen from a distance. They skirted a ranch light that glowed behind a cotton curtain, a small square that smelled like bacon if you closed your eyes. Nora kept her head up and her hand low on the horn. The pull at her side set in and did not sharpen. She checked it with her palm when the horses stood to breathe and felt it hold. They camped at the river where cottonwoods arm the bank and make dark shapes against the sky. Mason found a heel of dry ground under a leaning trunk and set a thumb-sized fire that did not smoke. He boiled snow in the coffee pot and dropped in a piece of jerk so small it softened to nothing in the water. He passed the tin cup and watched her sip until the shake left her hands. The wind laid down. The stripped branches overhead clicked as if counting. A train somewhere far threw a whistle that skated the cold and slid along the river. They slept sitting up, backs to the tree feet toward the ember. The next day they climbed onto the flats where the snow thins and sage keeps the ground. They crossed cattle sign and old wagon cuts patched with ice and dust. Twice they gave ground to riders from a distance, men moving west with their heads down and hats low. Mason set the bay into a shadow and waited until the sound drained away. One man turned his face and looked hard at the cottonwood where they stood. He saw branches and shade. He did not see them. By the second night, the ground changed. Snow gave way to brown patches and then to earth scarred by iron rims. Smoke showed itself in plumes with a factory smell, coal and oil, and a little iron in it. Nora breathed it and felt the old itch in her ribs that says a train yard is near. She tasted cinder on her tongue and had to swallow twice. Denver rose out of the plain in blocks and brick. A bell rang the hour in a voice that metal keeps for itself. Wheels rang on boards. Men called to one another with tired voices. A team backed a load up to a platform, and a foreman kept time with a hand. Steam pulled off the roof of the depot and drifted across the track like a low cloud. No one looked at them twice in the street. That is how cities keep their secrets. The United States Marshal's office sat a block from the depot brick walls, red as a cut on a cold morning windows, with glass so clean a man could see his chapped face in it. A hand-painted sign read, Elias Stone, United States Marshal. Mason tied the bay to the rail and looped Rosie's lead. He gave the saddlebag a small tap and felt the round shape firm under the cloth. Nora pulled her coat tight and tugged at the scarf. They went in. A clerk in a white collar sat behind a high desk and looked down his nose without standing. His pen stopped on the page, but he did not lift it clear. He sniffed, then found his voice. Business, he said. Mason set the saddlebag on the counter. We need the marshal, he said. We carry a confession on a wax cylinder and a dead sheriff's name to go with it. The clerk's mouth went crooked, ready for a smile that would not reach his eyes. It died quick. He slid from his stool and into the back. Elias Stone came out after the clerk and closed the door behind him with a soft hand. He had gray in his beard and the eyes of a man who knows 7 ways a morning can go and counts all of them before coffee. His coat was plain and well made. He glanced at the shabbiness of Mason's shirt and the band of cloth under Nora's collar and did not let his eyes stick there. Sit, he said. Tell me with care. They sat. Mason spoke in a level voice, giving names and places, never letting talk run ahead of facts. Nora gave Lily's name and Judge Hollis Crow's, and the way a room can smell of cheap perfume and power. She put Sheriff Pike Rollins in Mason's cabin with the stove hissing and the wind at the seams. She did not look at her hands or at the floor while she said it. She looked at the marshal. Can you show me this machine? Stone asked. Mason pulled the graphophone from the bag and set it on the desk. He set the horn, checked the spring, and took the wrapped cylinder in both hands as if the desk could tilt. He set the wax in the cradle and placed the needle. The machine whirred, and the room seemed to bend around the horn to listen. The scratches lifted into words, not pretty, not clean. A drunk man laying out his trade as if giving a county fair speech. Men in 3 counties sleep better because I carry the paper. A laugh? A judge pays his share. Stone did not look away from the horn. He watched air shape to sound and let something pass across his face that might have been anger if he had been a young man. That is enough, he said. Mason lifted the needle. Silence came back into the office like air shipped in a crate and opened fresh. Stone leaned his hands on the desk. He spoke as if reading off a sheet. You will be held for a period as a material witness, he said to Nora. You will be charged, and your claim of self-defense will be heard. You will be fed and given blankets. You will not be left among drunks and thieves. You will not be touched. He turned his eyes on Mason. You will be held on a charge of harboring and disturbing the peace in a court. You will have water and coffee, and you will keep your temper. Mason nodded once. Nora's mouth pressed in. She did not object. Stone reached for a bell. The clerk came at a trot with a ring of keys. Bring 2 deputies, Stone said. Secure a receipt for that cylinder and lock it in the evidence box. Then show our guests to the holding cells. He signed a line on a form and set his seal impression in red wax across the flap of a wooden case. He slipped the wrapped cylinder inside and closed the lid, then slid the case into a steel safe and turned the wheel. The click had a small final sound that made the room feel steadier. A deputy who smelled of boot oil and clean wool stood in the doorway and waited. "This way," he said. The cells were down a short hall, 4 doors to a side windows, set high, floors scrubbed iron bars without rust. The lights were not candles. They were glass drops that burned with a hiss steady as stars. The air was warm. Someone far down coughed once and turned over. The deputy opened 2 doors that faced each other and stood aside. Nora stepped in and touched the cot with 2 fingers. She sat and put her hands in her lap and looked at the small square of sky that the window offered. Mason sat across from her in the other cell. He could see her face through the bars in the hallway space. He set his hat on his knees and let his eyes rest. A guard brought tin cups of coffee and a plate with a heel of bread and a piece of cheese that tasted like salt and barn. Nora ate half and set the rest aside. The coffee shook in her cup once, then stayed steady. Mason drank 2 swallows and felt his chest uncoil an inch. Back in the office, Stone stood at the window and watched the people move by. A train pushed into the station yard and exhaled a long breath. He did not smile. He looked once at the safe and then at the door that led to the cells. He put his hand flat on the desk and stayed a moment longer before he went to write his telegrams. The days in Denver measured themselves by the hiss of the gas lamps and the soft footfall of deputies. Morning brought tin cups and the scrape of keys. Evening brought the low murmur of men in the hall and the rattle of the telegraph in the far office. Nora sat on her cot and watched the square of sky. Mason sat across the corridor with his hat on his knees and his boots set, even as if the floor might judge him. Elias Stone moved like water finds the lowest course. He sent 2 men north to Silver Gulch and 2 south to Pueblo. He stood in his coat at the depot and read the wire with a face that did not change. When he came back through the office door, he had coal dust on his sleeve. They heard the cylinder in a room with clean walls and a judge in a black coat who had not learned to smile at a man with authority. The graphophone spoke in scratches that turned to words. A line of men behind them did not shift. When the voice said a judge pays his share, someone let out a sound that started as a breath and ended as anger. Stone lifted a hand and pressed it into quiet. They brought a girl in from Pueblo with a scar at the corner of her mouth and a shawl that kept slipping. Lily looked at the door until she was sure no one would walk through it and make the room turn back into the other kind. She told what she could say without shaking apart. She did not look at Nora when she said it. She kept her eyes on Stone, and he kept his on her so she could finish. When it was done, the judge wrote for a long time, the scratch of his pen loud as the voice had been. He spoke without weight in it. "Self-defense," he said, and Nora's hands came into her lap and lay still. "Holding on, harboring, and a fine," he said, and Mason's jaw relaxed without making a show of it. Stone reached into his own pocket and set a packet of bills on the clerk's desk and did not ask for change. Blue Jay House was shuttered that week. A marshal's deputy nailed paper to its door, while men watched from across the street and pretended they were not watching. They said Judge Hollis Crow's name in the rail yard, and in a church vestibule, and at a table where men played cards soft, and they said it without admiration. Stone wrote another wire and did not wait to see who read it. When they gave Mason his hat and opened Nora's door, the light outside was thin and clean. The wind off the yard smelled of soot and something like rain, if a man had a good memory. They walked out under it and stood a moment with the city sorting itself around them. The ride home took what it took. Snow had retreated into ditches and under fences. The land showed ribs and a few green hairs of grass. Mason kept the bay to a steady pace. Rosie bore what she was given without complaint and stopped when told. At the river, meltwater ran cold and loud, chewing at the ice and making a new edge every hour. The valley opened in a color that was not winter. Patches of earth lay the brown of bread crust. The cottonwoods wore a pale haze where buds think about swelling. The cabin stood where it had stood. The barn was still a black frame against the slope. The wind chime on the nail under the eave spoke once a small, bright voice. Inside, the floor still held the stain where Rollins had fallen. It had gone from red to something dull that old wood knows how to keep. Nora filled a bucket and tipped it into a basin and made lye water that stung the eyes. She scrubbed until her shoulders ached and the boards went to a flat, clean gray. Mason scrubbed beside her until the skin on his knuckles thinned and split. They did not talk while they worked. The sound of bristles and the soft slap of water covered what words would have had to do. He pulled the rotted water from the well by the bucket until the rope ran easy and the smell went from wrong to nothing. He sent clean buckets down and brought up clean cold that fogged the rim in the morning air. He drank and let it sit in his mouth so he could be sure. At dusk, they carried what was left of the calico dress to the place where the barn had been and built a small fire on a bed of stones. The smell of pinon smoke went straight up and did not wander. Nora stood with the cloth in her hands and watched the flame take the first corner and turn it to curl and ash. She unbuttoned the collar of Mason's spare shirt and let one shoulder slip down. The mark lay there on the skin of blue jay pinned inside a star-old scar tissue raised and pale. "Heat it," she said. He did not ask her to think it over. He did not ask her to wait. He took the iron from the stove, a bar he used to lift lids, and held it until it glowed low and steady. He set it in her hand and kept his own hand on hers so the weight would not tremble. She placed the heat where she meant it to go. The sound was a quick, wet hiss. Smoke from the wood and something else mixed and lifted. Nora's jaw tightened and her eyes watered and cleared again. She did not speak. He drew the iron away and wrapped her shoulder with a strip of clean linen he had torn earlier and warmed by the stove. He slid his coat over her without looking at the ground. She let the coat settle and stood until the shaking left her legs. The fire ate the last of the calico and went to coals. The sky over the range held one thin band of color before it fell to iron. Back in the cabin, he set the bandage clean and snug and tied the ends with a neat square knot. She sat on the cot and breathed through her teeth while the first bite dulled. He banked the stove. The kettle took its place in the corner. The wind chime said its piece and fell quiet. Water in the bucket gleamed like a made promise. The room smelled of scrubbed wood and smoke and soap and the faint sharpness of a thing newly ended. By late October, the valley wore a thin skin of frost each morning. Breath hung low over the creek, and the cottonwoods had gone pale gold that a hard wind could take in 1 hour. Mason set stones for a small barn on evenings when the light held. He tamped earth and checked the line with a length of twine. When his back complained, he straightened slowly and looked toward the house for the thin column of smoke that said the stove was doing its job. Inside, Nora worked dough with the heels of her hands until the tacky feel turned smooth and elastic. Yeast made its small, warm smell. The floor had been scrubbed so often the boards showed soft gray where the stained place used to be. The wind chime clicked now and then at the nail by the door, and sounded less like a warning and more like someone saying, "I am here." The first thing Mason heard was a wheel that did not want to turn. A low groan carried across the yard, then a voice that called to horses in a tone that knew them. He put the hammer down and walked to the road. A canvas-topped wagon came along the fence with one wheel listing. Letters flaked along the side said, "Children's Aid Society East." 4 horses pulled slow heads down. The woman on the seat held the reins with sure hands and a jaw set for long days. Her bonnet had a stiff edge. She took in Mason in one look and measured the roofline, the smoke, the space between the house and the ruined barn. "Sir," she said, "B. Fryer. We are bound east." Axel cracked 2 bends back. "I ask shelter one night and only the hearth for the children." "You have it," Mason said. "Water for the team and heat for the little ones. We have bread on." He walked alongside while she drove into the yard. The horses stopped, with the sigh that teams give when men are decent. He took the heads while she climbed down. She was practical and tired and did not waste words. Her eyes went once to the charred barn frame and once to the hinge marks cut into the door plank, and then she moved past them. Nora stepped into the doorway with flour on her wrists and the heat of the oven on her face. She wiped her hands on her apron and nodded to the woman. "Thank you," Mrs. Fryer said without ceremony. She unlatched the tail and lifted the canvas flap. "Come along," she called. "Mind your steps. There is bread and hot drink if you make your manners." Sixtus children climbed out and gathered into a knot. Their coats were gray and the same, ears stuck from under caps. Faces were thin and cautious in the way that comes from travel and from not knowing where the night will be. They ranged from a boy of maybe 10 with a gap where his front teeth should be, to a girl no taller than Nora's hip, who kept one fist in the hem of her coat and hummed under her breath as if to talk to herself. Mason took 2 at a time by the shoulders and guided them toward the door. Nora stepped back into the heat and made room at the hearth. She set the kettle to singing and poured molasses into tin cups and cut it with hot water so it would go down easy. The children wrapped hands around the cups and breathed in the sweet and drank like they had been told to take their time and could not help being quick. "Boots by the wall," Nora said, and the oldest boy nodded and began to line them up himself, toe to heel, tongues out to dry. Mrs. Fryer stood by the door and watched the heat touch faces. She set her gloves on the nail by the chime and rolled her shoulders like a woman who has carried a pack too far and knows there is farther still. "We cracked on the far bend," she said. I can mend it in light with a length of iron and a loop of rawhide. The road is kind once the valley opens. You have done the right thing, and I thank you for it. You will have soup, Nora said. It is only bones and a carrot, but there is bread with a crust. A crust will do, Mrs. Fryer said. She looked at the little girl who had not moved from where she stood just inside the door. Annabelle, she said. Say, thank you. The child looked up. Her hair was a pale straw color where it had escaped its braid. Her eyes were a blue that had learned to watch before choosing a place to land. She made a small bob. The humming started again, the sound a person makes when she has nothing else to hold. Nora turned. The tune was 6 notes small and sure, a lift and a fall and a lift again. Her hands stilled. Flour dust shook from the air. She took one step without meaning to and caught herself with a hand on the edge of the table. The breath she took did not find its way all at once. What is that song? Nora asked. The words were soft, so the child could set them where she needed. Annabelle stopped humming. She put one finger to her lower lip and thought about telling. She looked to Mrs. Fryer as if to ask if this was allowed. Go on, Mrs. Fryer said. Say, basim. Oh, I do not know, Annabelle said. It is mine. It is the one I have. Where did you learn it? Nora asked. The girl shook her head. It is just there, she said, and she smiled a little, as if the idea that something could be just there was a gift you could give yourself. Mrs. Fryer came nearer, with a small shift of her shoulders. She came from Laramie Orphanage, she said. Paper says foundling, mother deemed unfit. That is the word it uses, years ago. She has been in 3 houses and 2 wagons. She hums when she is not spoken to, and sometimes when she is. Nora put her hand to the chair back and held it. The room went quiet in a tight way, like snow when it decides to fall. The stove popped. The chime lifted once and set itself down. Mason crossed the room without hurry and stood just behind Nora, close enough that his hand could find her shoulder if she swayed. He did not touch her yet. He watched the small girl at the edge of the light. The girl looked at the bread on the table, and at the cups, and then at Nora's face, and then back to the cups. She hummed a fragment again without knowing she had. Nora crouched so she did not look down at the little one. She put both hands on her knees because she did not trust them if they were free. She did not reach. My name is Nora, she said. May I sit with you while you drink? Annabelle nodded. She came a step and then another, stopping where a board creaked. Nora sat on the floor so they were level the skirt of her dress pooling around her. Annabelle came close and settled with care, feet tucked under the hem of her coat. Nora poured molasses and hot water into a bowl and held it with both hands so the child could take it and not spill. Annabelle took a small sip, and then a longer one, and then held the cup to her chest the way some hold a warm stone. Do you know other songs? Nora asked, or only that one? This one is the one I like when it is cold, Annabelle said. She hummed it again. The 6 notes went around the room and found the places where echoes live. Nora's eyes filled the way a spring does when frost lets go. She blinked, and the water stayed where it should. She breathed, and it was less hard. Good, she said. It is a good one to keep. Mason set a bowl of soup on the table and set bread beside it and stepped back. The older boy herded the rest to the bench with a bossy kindness that meant he had been asked to keep order many times and had found a way to do it without getting hit. The kettle hissed, and someone laughed once, quick and surprised. Mrs. Fryer stood with a cup of coffee she had not yet raised and watched the child and the woman on the floor as if there were something there she could not put her fine, tired finger on. When the bowls were emptied and the crusts gone, the children made nests along the wall and on the floor in a crescent of bodies pointed at the stove. Nora brought quilts from the cot and shook them over small shoulders. Mason went out with a lantern to check the horses and came back with a handful of snow to melt. He closed the door with his shoulder and set the bar quiet. The chime moved with the door and then went still. Annabelle lay with her head near Nora's knee. She had kept her cup and rolled it back and forth between her palms, long after it held only heat. When her eyes began to blink slow, she turned onto her side and reached out with one hand, the way a child does to find the edge of a bed. Her fingers touched Nora's skirt and rested there. Nora did not move for a count, then set her own hand lightly over the small knuckles and left it. Mrs. Fryer took the chair by the door and tipped her hat brim down and closed her eyes in the way that says, I am awake even when I am not. Mason set the last log so it would burn long without smoke. He hung his coat on the peg and stood with his palm flat on the door for a breath to feel the cold push back and be held there. He turned and took his place by the stove, not in the chair but on the floor with his back against it. He could see the faces in a row, the damp mouths of sleep, the scabbed knuckles, the tiny twitch a dream brings to eyelashes. The wind found its way down from the range and set the cottonwoods to hissing. Snow began to tap the window pane, and then to lay quiet over the yard. The ruined barn's dark ribs caught it and held white in their angles. The stack of stones that would be a barn foundation sat square and patient. The well bucket hung straight, and the rope no longer stank of anything but old hemp. The small house held its heat like a secret. Annabelle's breathing settled into the slow kind. Nora's hand stayed where it was. She looked at the child's hair where the lamp picked up strands that were almost white. She looked at Mason, and he looked back, and there was no question in it and no answer required. He reached and set his hand on her shoulder, now firm and warm, and left it. The chime on the nail gave a soft single voice and then was content. The bread smell, the iron warmth, the little sounds of sleep, all of it made a circle. The night laid itself over the valley and drew the edges in. The room did what rooms are meant to do. It kept what mattered from the cold. Outside, the snow went about its business. Inside, the last light slid down the wall and left the faces in peace. The stove ticked, the wind whispered, and the house breathed with the people in it. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.